International Business, Masters of Commerce, second semester, Mangalore University, session 15. International Business Decision. In this session, you're going to learn about the globalization and national sovereignty, managing the firm in the global scenario, and globalization and the world's poor. Learning objective to discuss about the globalization and national sovereignty and globalization of world's poor and managing the firm in global scenario. Session outcome: the students are able to understand about how the world economy is becoming more global. Globalization and national sovereignty. Another concern voiced by critics the globalization is that today's increasingly interdependent global economy shifts the economic power away from the national governments and towards supranational organizations such as the World Trading Organization, the European Union, and the United Nations. As perceived by critics, unelected bureaucrats now impose policies on the democratically elected governments of nation state, thereby undermining the sovereignty of those states and limiting the nation's ability to control its own destiny. The World Trade Organization is a favorite target of those who attack the headlong rush toward a global economy. As noted earlier, the WTO was founded in 1994 to police the world trading system established by the GATT. The WTO attributes trade disputes between the 154 states that are signatories to the GATT. The arbitration panel can issue a ruling instructing a member state to change trade policies that violate the GATT regulations. If the violator refuses to comply with the ruling, the WTO allows other states to impose appropriate trade sanctions on the transgressors. As a result, according to one prominent critic, US environmentalist, consumer rights advocate, and sometime presidential candidate Ralph Nader tells, under the new system, many decisions that affect billions of people are no longer made by local or national governments, but instead, if challenged by any WTO member nation, would be deferred to a group of unelected bureaucrats sitting behind closed doors in Geneva. The bureaucrats can decide whether or not people in California can prevent the destruction of the last virgin forest or determine if carcinogenic pesticides can be banned from their foods or whether the European countries have the right to ban dangerous biotech hormones in meat. At risk is the very basis of democracy and accountable decision making. In contrast to Nader, many economists and politicians maintain that the power of supranational organizations such as the WTO is limited to what nation states collectively agree to grant. They argue that bodies such as United Nations and the WTO exist to serve the collective interest of member states, not to subvert those interests. Supporters of supranational organization point out that the power of these bodies rests largely on their ability to persuade member states to follow a certain action. If these bodies fail to serve the collective interest of member states, those states will withdraw their support and the supranational organization will quickly collapse. In this view, the real power still resides with individual nation states, not supranational organizations. Globalization and the world's poor. The critics of globalization argue that despite the supposed benefits associated with free trade and investment, over the past 100 years or so, the gap between the rich and the poor nations of the world has gotten wider. In 1870, the average income per capita in the world's 17 richest nations was 2.4 times that of all other countries. In 1990, the same group was 4.5 times as rich as the West. While recent history has shown that some of the world's poorer nations are capable of rapid periods of economic growth witness, the transformation that has occurred in some Southeast Asian nations such as South Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia, there appear to be strong forces for stagnation among the world's poorest nations. A quarter of the countries with a GDP per capita of less than $1,000 in 1960 had growth rates of less than zero from 1960 to 1995, and A third had growth rates of less than 0.05%. Critics argue that if globalization is such a positive development, this divergence between the rich and the poor should not have occurred, although the reasons for economic stagnation vary. Several factors stand out, none of which have anything to do with the free trade or globalization. Many of the world's poorest countries have suffered from totalitarian governments, economic policies that destroyed wealth rather than facilitated its creation, endemic corruption, scant protection for property rights, and war. Such factors help explain why countries such as Afghanistan, Cambodia, Cuba, Haiti, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, Sudan, Vietnam, and Zaire have failed to improve the economic lot of their citizens during recent decades. A complementing factor is the rapidly expanding populations in many of these countries. Without a major change in government, population growth may exacerbate their problems. Promoters of free trade argue that the best way for these countries to improve their lot is to lower their to free trade and investment and to implement economic policies based on free market economics. Many of the world's poorer nations are being held back by large debt burdens. Of particular concerns are the 40 or so highly indebted poorer countries, HIPCs. Please note HIPCs means highly indebted poorer countries, which are home to some 700 million people. Among these countries, the average government debt burden has been as high as 85% of the value of the economy as measured by gross domestic product, and the annual cost of serving government debt consumed 15% of the country's export earnings. Servicing such a heavy debt load leaves the government of these countries with little left to invest in important public infrastructure projects such as education, healthcare, roads, and power. The result is the HIPCs, highly indebted poorer countries. The result is HIPCs are trapped in a cycle of poverty and debt that inhibits economic development. Free trade alone, some argue, is a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite to help these countries bootstrap themselves out of poverty. Instead, large scale debt relief is needed for the world's poorest nations to give them the opportunity to restructure their economies and start the long climb toward prosperity. The supporters of debt relief also argue that the new democratic government in poor nations should not be forced to honor the debts that were incurred and mismanaged long ago by the corrupt and dictatorial predecessors. In the late 1990s, a debt relief movement began to gain around ground among the political establishment in the world's richer nations, fueled by high profile endorsements from Irish rock star um, Bono, who has been a tireless and increasingly effective advocate for debt relief, the Dalai Lama, and the influential Harvard economist Jeffrey Sachs. The debt relief movement was instrumental in persuading the US to enact legislation in 2000 that provided $435 million in debt relief for HIPCs. More important, perhaps, the United States have backed an IMF plan to sell some of its gold reserves and use the proceeds to help with the debt relief. The IMF and World Bank have now picked up the banner and have embarked on a systematic debt relief program. For such a program to have a lasting effect, however, debt relief must be matched by wise investment in public projects that boost economic growth and by the adoption of economic policies that facilitate investment and trade. The rich nations of the world also can help by reducing barriers to the importation of products from the world's poorer nations, particularly tariffs on imports of agricultural products and textiles. High tariff barriers and the impediments to trade make it difficult for poorer countries to export more of their agricultural production. The World Trade Organization has estimated that if the developed nations of the world eradicated the subsidies to their agricultural producers and removed tariff barriers to trade in agriculture, this would raise the global economic welfare by $128 billion, with $30 billion of that going to developing nations, many of which are highly indebted. The faster growth associated with expanded trade in agriculture could reduce the number of U2s Bono and actively lobbied to have the people living in poverty by as much as 13% by 2015, according to unpayable debt of poorer countries written off to the WTO. Managing the firm in the global marketplace, or managing the firm in the global scenario. An international business is any firm that engages in international trade or investment. A firm does not have to become a multinational enterprise investing directly in operations in other countries to engage in international business. Although multinational enterprises are international businesses, all a firm has to do is to export or import the products from other countries. As the world shifts toward a truly integrated global economy, more firms, both large and small, are becoming international businesses. What does this shift toward a global economy mean for managers within an international business? As their organization increasingly engage in cross-border trade and investment, managers need to recognize that the task of managing an international business differs from that of managing a purely domestic business in many ways. At the most fundamental level, the differences arises from the simple fact that countries are different. Countries differ in their cultures, political systems, economic systems, legal systems, and levels of economic development. Despite all the talk about the emerging global village and despite the trend toward the globalization of markets and production, many of these differences are very profound and enduring. Differences between countries require that an international business vary its practices country by country. Marketing a product in Brazil may require a different approach from marketing the product in Germany. Managing US workers might require different skills than managing Japanese workers. Maintaining close relations with a particular level of government may be very important in Mexico and irrelevant in Great Britain. The business strategy pursued in Canada might not work in South Korea, and so on. Managers in an international business must not only be sensitive to these differences, but they must also adopt the appropriate policies and strategies for coping with them. Much of this book is devoted to explaining the sources of these differences and the methods of successfully coping with them. A further way in which international business differs from domestic business is the greater complexity of managing an international business. In addition to the problem that arise from the differences between countries, a manager in an international business is confronted with a range of other issues that the manager in a domestic business never confronts. The managers of all international business must decide where in the world to site production activities to minimize the cost and to maximize value added. They must decide whether it is ethical to adhere to the lower labor and environmental standards found in many less developed nations. Then they must decide how best to coordinate and control globally dispersed production activities. The managers in an international business also must decide which foreign markets to enter and which to avoid. They must choose the appropriate mode of entering a particular foreign country. Is it best to export its goods to the foreign country? Should the firm allow a local company to produce its product under license in that country? Should the firm enter into a joint venture with a local firm to produce its product in that country? Or should the firm set up a wholly owned subsidiary to serve the market in that country? As we shall see, the choice of entry mode is critical, but it is major implications for the long term health of the firm. Conducting business transactions across national borders requires understanding the rules governing the international trading and investment system. Managers in an international business must also deal with the government restrictions on international trade and investment. They must find ways to work within the limits imposed by the specific governmental interventions. Even though many governments are nominally committed to free trade, they often intervene to regulate the cross border trade and investments. Managers with the international business must develop strategies and policies for dealing with such interventions. Cross border transactions also require that money be converted from the firm's home currency into a foreign currency and vice versa. Because currency exchange rates vary in response to changing economic conditions, managers in an international business must develop policies for dealing with exchange rate movements. A firm that adopts a wrong policy can lose large amounts of money, whereas one that adopts the right policy can increase the profitability of its international transactions. Thank you.